Hello, this is William Michael of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. Today is Saturday, August 6th. And this afternoon, I took some time to post a new opportunity on the Academy website as I continue to work through the first parts of the mission of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy and begin to devote more and more time now to tutoring and teaching of the classical liberal arts and philosophy. I'm looking at options that I can offer to Catholic parents to provide their children with the best classical Catholic education possible. And there's a student that I particularly have in mind and am concerned about. It's not an individual student, but there's a certain kind of student that I am especially concerned about, and it's a young Catholic boy or girl, teenager who is devout as a Catholic, who is interested in religious vocations. Everything may not be crystal clear in terms of vocation, but they have an interest in religious vocations. And they're at a point in their life where if they have the opportunity to study daily with an adult Catholic who loves the Church, loves Catholic studies, is completely devoted to classical learning, and wants to help devout Catholic children, that vocation might be nourished and developed and might come to fruition. I've had the privilege of working with students like this in the past. Students who by age 12 or 13 were beginning to develop an interest in a religious vocation. Students who studied the lives of the saints, who grew up in devout Catholic families, who attend Mass regularly, and who really can't think of anything that they would be interested in doing outside of worshiping God, outside of living in the service of Christ and His Church, who want no distractions, aren't interested in worldly things, aren't concerned about what else is going on outside the Church, but are consumed with an interest in the Church, in the saints, in the priesthood, in prayer, in eternal life. These are graces. This interest in heavenly things, this interest in the worship of God, this living faith, this strong hope and love for God, these are graces. And these graces, when they're strong in young people, like Dominic Savio and Aloysius Gonzaga and Thomas Aquinas, when these graces are strong in young people, those young people are usually given those graces for the sake of a religious vocation. And in our generation, in our society, these children are often forced to neglect those vocations, to turn away from them, to jump through hoops in modern schools. They get picked on by their peers because they're not interested in the cool stuff going on. They don't know who the TikTok influencers are. They're not up on all the sports scores and the celebrities. They get picked on. They're made to feel uncomfortable, and this social bullying goes on and can eventually draw them out from what was a true vocation. And I'm always especially concerned for those kids. That's even what originally motivated me to get into education, was that I wanted to help the devout children who wanted to do great things and had no opportunity to do those things. So what I'm offering in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, and I'll offer as many of these opportunities as I can, and I'll devote my attention to them as much as there's interest. I'd be willing to devote all of my interest to these opportunities, but I'm offering private instruction for such students through the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. What this means when I say private instruction, I'd like to explain with a little bit of historical background. And I think you'll see as I explain this what's wrong with how education is arranged in modern society. In modern society, when a parent wants to arrange for an education for their child, they begin looking at schools. They begin looking around at what's available locally. They begin looking at what they can afford. And maybe if they have resources, they can look at something like a boarding school, a Catholic boarding school, maybe run by a religious community. But the prices for these schools can be very great. I worked at private schools. I know what the costs are. The costs are great. They can be from $10,000, $12,000, all the way up to $40,000 and $50,000 per year for tuition and housing and so on, or even for tuition alone. Easily $15,000, $20,000 per year. And this is normal in modern society, but when we think about this, it doesn't make much sense and it's not very effective. And the reason why it's not effective is because parents pay this great amount of money, relatively great amount of money. They don't necessarily get access for this money to the best teachers. In fact, I know that when I was teaching in private schools, the private school often hired unqualified teachers because they were desperate. The school would have 2 or 3 remaining spots on the faculty open in August, and the bar would get lower and lower as to who they would offer those jobs to. We had teachers come in who had no teaching experience, poor academic backgrounds, no real gifts or ability to teach and influence students, no rapport or ability to develop rapport with students, and yet they would get hired because the school just had to fill spots. So those high tuition numbers don't necessarily get a parent access to expert teachers for their children. And even worse than that, that tuition money, that high cost of enrollment in a private school also throws a child in with a body of students that isn't necessarily interested in spiritual things, isn't necessarily interested in studying or learning. And there's a great deal of bad moral influence within the student body. And that's even true at a so-called Christian school. I know because I saw it. I saw immoral behavior among students. I'm talking about drinking, premarital sex, drug use in a private Christian school, high tuition, top-notch private school. All of that stuff was there. And so paying the tuition to send your kid to a school doesn't necessarily get for him excellent Catholic instruction or quality Catholic society. And yet, sacred scripture teaches us He who walks with wise men shall become wise. And so the modern approach to sending kids to private schools really isn't a wise plan, because it doesn't necessarily bring about the desired end, and it costs a great deal of money for what are in most places disappointing results. Throughout history, this was never done. No one did this throughout history. When Thomas More in the 1500s wanted to have his children educated, he didn't start looking at schools to enroll his children in. When Thomas Aquinas' parents were interested in having their son educated, they didn't look around for which private school they could enroll him in and then just pick what appeared to be the best or most affordable option. It wasn't through schools that children were educated. Throughout history, families that had the resources to provide for the education of their children sought out wise and devout men, individuals. They sought out devout individuals who they trusted, who they knew were effective teachers, who they knew were sober and serious about their studies, and they hired those individual men to teach their children. They hired those individual men to serve as guides and mentors, tutors for their children. And the education that the children received was more like an apprenticeship. A professional scholar taught a child how to become a professional scholar. A philosopher taught a child how to become a philosopher. A religious man or woman taught a child how to become a religious man or woman. That's how education was done among the noble families throughout history. They didn't send kids to schools. They didn't just write tuition checks to institutions. They sought out individuals whom they trusted, and they arranged to have those individuals apprentice or tutor their children and guide their education. I would argue that that's the best possible option for a Catholic child who has a particular interest, to find someone who you trust, who is skilled, who is wise, who desires to teach, and hire that person to teach the desired skill to your children. And if we're talking about a child who has an interest in a religious vocation that's pursued through classical Catholic studies, I recommend that you consider hiring an individual rather than paying an institution for that education. And it's this opportunity that I'm offering in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. I'm offering private instruction for a small number of qualified students. And by qualified, what I mean is that they have an interest in religious life, possibly. They have an interest in classical Catholic learning. They have an interest in contemplative life. They like to pray. They like to go to Mass. They like to read the Bible. They like to learn about saints. They're interested in these things, and the schools would not support them in these interests. The schools would distract them from these interests. And maybe mom and dad have a household where that life is supported and nurtured, And the best thing would be for the child to remain in that environment, but have the assistance and direction and support and companionship of a zealous Catholic teacher who can work with him in what is a proven environment. And it's proven because it's been able to nurture this devout spirit in the child already. My advice would be keep the child in that devout family environment, but provide him with the academic expertise and teaching and support that he needs to fulfill his potential. And that opportunity I'm making available in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. I'm offering private instruction to a small number of students. This is not a cheap service. This is not something that anyone can just jump into. This is an expensive service. You just have to think about what a reasonable cost would be. And I think that this will be a fraction of that cost, but it's still an expensive service. Tutoring rates average around $50 an hour in America. So just imagine if you were to hire a tutor for 40 hours a week, that would be $2,000 a week. If you were to cut that in half and pay $25 an hour for tutoring and hire a tutor for 40 hours a week, you would be down to $1,000 per week. That would be extremely expensive. But that's what it costs. That's the kind of number that parents have to realize families throughout history paid to have these men work with their children. They had to provide for the life of the tutor. They had to cover his costs of living and bring him into the house to stay with them. Maybe they boarded the tutor as part of his payment. Maybe they had a guest house or some place to live where the tutor was able to stay. But they had to provide for the costs of this man whom they wanted to teach their children. And if we compare that cost to the cost of private school, we find the costs are similar. You could send a child to a school and pay tuition, or you can take a different approach, and rather than do that, hire an individual whom you trust to come to you, to work directly with your child in an environment that you already know is good for that child. And there really is no environment better, other than a monastery maybe. There's no environment better for a devout Catholic child than a devout Catholic home. So I'm offering the opportunity for Catholic parents who have the kind of student that I've described to arrange private instruction where I will work with a student throughout the day, every day, guiding his studies, helping him throughout the day, giving him tasks to work on throughout the day, keeping him accountable to those tasks, supervising his studies, assisting with any questions he has during the day, grading his assignments, helping him through all his lessons and courses, supporting him in his continued discernment of religious vocation, encouraging him in his spiritual life, even offering to pray and study with these children through private instruction. The rate that I'm charging for this service is not the rate that tutoring would cost, which, like I said, even if we cut the average tutoring cost in half, it would still be $1,000 a week. That's still very expensive. I would be charging only $1,000 per month. So if you divide $1,000 divided by 4 weeks, that's $250 per week. Divide that by 30 to 40 hours, and you can see the rate is actually very low, but it's sufficient because I can serve a number of students through our online tools and resources and all of the resources that I have in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. I can serve a number of students and afford to do this and afford to offer it at this cost to parents. And I think we can offer these children a much better alternative than exists in any local or even distant private schools. And I'd like to begin doing that. My ideal would be to have a small group of students that I work with daily. That would be my ideal. I know that it will take time for that group to develop, but that's what I'm hoping to establish, is a small group of devout Catholic students who work with me using online conference tools, just like we do in tutoring sessions, but using them throughout the day, working together, collaborating. As I work in my office doing my own work, just always staying in touch with these students, communicating with them throughout the day, helping them with their studies, providing them with direction for their daily assignments and tasks, grading their work, maintaining their records, helping them through difficult parts. I'm interested in finding a small number of students who would be interested in doing this. And I think the price is within reach for Catholic families who have such students. So if anyone is interested in providing this private instruction for a student, and I'm not asking for students to be incredibly gifted intellectually. We know that many saints weren't gifted intellectually, but they were devout. That's the key. They were devout. They were reverent. They were interested in spiritual things. These things are divine gifts. Intellectual weaknesses can be overcome. I'm not concerned about that. As a teacher, I don't feel that my students have to have great intellectual gifts. I'm patient to work with students who need more help or more time. But I can't give students faith, hope, and charity. Those things can only be given by God. And so a student who possesses those gifts, who has those graces, who's interested in religion, especially in this perverted generation, I really want to help that student. I can't afford to do it for free, but I can do it affordably, I believe. And I believe that considering the options that are available and the preciousness of these kids, I think that the price that I can do it at is reasonable and within reach for at least some parents. So private instruction is now available. It's advertised on the Academy website. If you go to the main website at classicalliberalarts.com and you click on the enrollment tab on the top menu and then click on tutoring, one of the options that you'll see under tutoring is private instruction. And there's some more information there. And all a parent has to do who's interested in arranging this private instruction relationship with or between me and a student, all you'd have to do is start that subscription and we can get to work immediately. I'll provide all of the instructions and all of the details for how things can work. And again, I've done this with students in the past when I hosted students at my boarding school and when I worked with students before in private schooling. I always looked out for these students. I was always extra careful to find and help these students and develop relationships with them to support them. I know what those relationships need. And I'm confident, I'm very confident that we can provide what they need through remote instruction and tutoring. And so if you're interested in that, if you've got one of these precious kids who is devout and interested in in religious vocation, and I don't mean this is crystal clear, the vocation is sealed in stone or anything like that. I mean, they're open to vocation. They're interested in religion. They love the saints. They're interested in reading sacred scripture. They're interested in praying and going to Mass. If you have a student with those graces, I would really love to have the opportunity to help nurture those gifts and join to them classical Catholic learning in the safe environment of that child's home, which has already proven to be a healthful nursery for his development. I would like to be able to work with that child in that environment through the remote tools that we have and through all of the resources I have in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy to try to help cultivate and strengthen that devotion, so that, God willing, we could help some of these kids fulfill these vocations and not be drawn away from them, as so many are today. So if you're interested in talking more about this private instruction, just get in touch with me, because I think I can make this affordable, relatively at least, and I think I can make it very effective. God bless.